Greetings, folks. Welcome to the channel. So, I don't know about you, but I've been feeling pretty rubbish for the last couple of months. I've had blocked nose, coughing, sneezing, fevers, like restless nights, just fatigue and exhaustion. And it's kind of knocked me out. So I was kind of waiting until I felt better to make a new video. But then I thought, you know what? I might be waiting forever. So I'm making one now while I'm still in the throes of my congestion and this cleansing process. I thought I would do a video about the alchemical view of this kind of sickness and disease. So obviously there's lots of information and misinformation and deception around the nature of disease and the true causes of disease. But when we look back into history before modern medicine, we see that there was actually an understanding of sickness and disease for about a period of 2,000 years that served humanity quite well, like all over the world. And though it's deemed to be debunked now by modern medicine, it is actually something that was quite useful and served humanity for a really long time. And so I'm going to talk about that today. And this is the system of Humours, which is about the liquids in the body and their relative balance and how that affects our state of health or disease. Okay, so I'm going to do a little presentation. So I just want to start with this little art piece I did here. Never forget, never forget, guys, the elements, fire, air, water, and earth are the fundamental building blocks of our reality. This is what's fundamental. Now, you may have seen these symbols before. The fire and the air are denoted by upward pointing triangles because they move up. If you capture fire in your hand and you let it go, it goes up. If you capture air or gas in your hand and you let it go, it goes up, back to the air. Water and earth are denoted by downward pointing triangles because they go down. If you lift water up and let it go, it will fall back down to the water. If you lift up the earth and let it go, it will fall back down to the earth. In Aristotelian physics, it was understood that everything in creation has its place and will seek to return to its natural place. So earth seeks to return to the earth, water seeks to return to the water, air to the air, and fire to the fire. Also, the two elements above are the masculine elements, and the upward pointing triangle is also symbolic of the phallus. Likewise, the two bottom elements, earth and water, are symbolized by downward pointing triangles, which is symbolic of the womb. So earth and water are Mother Earth or Mother Nature, and fire and air are Father Sky. Now, these elements have essential perceptual qualities, and these are hot and dry, which is the quality of fire, hot and wet, which is the quality of air, cold and wet, which is water, and cold and dry, which is earth. Now, if you live in Scotland like me, you might be thinking, hot air? What are you talking about? The air is not hot. And yeah, well, you'd be right. It's not really hot here, but these are, of course, hot, dry, wet, hot and cold represent a scale. But the reason that the air is considered hot and wet is because, well, it's warmer than the water. It's warmer than freezing, so it has movement. So air is a fluid. It's able to move in currents and vortices and so on. So that's what it means by wetness. It's able to move like a fluid, and it's hot or warm in that it's not freezing. It's not condensed. It also has a moisture content within it. So, and then, so these four properties are manifest in us in four fluids, which the alchemists called humours. Now, in humoral theory, the idea is that these four liquids can be in balance or out of balance. We can have excess amounts of them, and when we have an excess in one or more of these fluids, we get certain symptoms or conditions. So let's just look at the table here. So our blood corresponds with the warm and wet, okay, or hot and wet, which is the air quality. And alchemists called this sanguine, which meant a cheerful or a social temperament, and it was associated with springtime. So warm and wet is the characteristic of spring. Warm and dry, summer. Cold and dry, autumn. Cold and wet, winter. So each of these humours has a corresponding season, but also a corresponding fluid in the body. So the warm and dry fluid is called yellow bile, and this is produced by the liver, and it helps with the dissolving and digestion of fats or oil-based substances. This corresponds with fire and the summer, and the personality type corresponding to this is called choleric, which is like passionate or fiery. So chole, the prefix chole in choleric or cholesterol, means bile. And with black bile, this is the cold and dry temperament, and this is produced in the spleen. This is melancholy. And actually the word melancholy means black bile. Melas means black, and chole means bile. And this is like sadness, depression, and corresponds with autumn. Then we have phlegm, which is the cold and wet temperament, or phlegmatic it's called, which is like calm and steady, which is probably how I am right now, as I'm, full of phlegm. So for me then, I probably get sick like this, once or twice a year, but I never got sick like this when I lived in Hawaii for 2.5 years. So I think a lot of what I experience with these like colds and flus is to do with the weather and to do with the amount of different sorts of fluids in the body. I'll show you what I mean. So they would say then that the disease or illness corresponds with an imbalance in the humour. So excess blood, so too much blood, will result in fever, redness, itching or swelling. Fever, I've had a lot of fever this last few weeks, and one thing about it is that you notice every single part of your body aches, right? It's like no part is left untouched, right? It's like it's just everywhere you move your attention, there's pain. And this is because it's the blood. The blood is carried to every part of the body, right? So there's a problem with the blood. There's an excess of blood. And of course, in the old days, they would use like leeches to, or bloodletting to actually let a bit of blood out to reduce the fever, because they understood it as being due to an excess of blood. So an excess of yellow bile, which is produced by the liver, this leads to anger, irritability, bitterness, and digestive problems. And this is called choleric. And if you've ever had a baby before, you might have heard of colic. And this is, again, chole is bile. So colic, when the baby gets really, really angry and grumpy and like uncomfortable and irritable, like this is an excess of the yellow bile. Okay, so then excess of black bile, that leads to depression, sadness, and melancholy, or melancholia, which means black bile. Um, and as I say, is associated with the spleen. And then if you have excess phlegm, this is like your lethargy, cold and flus, and respiratory issues. So now, as I say, these cold flu things, I think most people get them every year, particularly in the north here. If you don't, you're very lucky and you're doing well. But so this is for me the most common symptoms of sickness I get is fever and phlegm, and often like both at the same time. So we know then that's hot and wet and cold and wet. Now, the more I started thinking about this, it really started to make sense. Now, the weather here in the UK for all of winter really has been terrible. Like, I would say artificially engineered, not natural weather at all, but just constant grey cloud and fog, just gloom. Just gloom every day. No sun, no moon. Yeah, very, very gloomy, very grey, and not a lot of light. And the temperature is kept at about 1 to 5 degrees, just above freezing. And the air is very wet because you're right on the coast here. And so it feels below zero. It feels like -5, even though it's technically above zero. And this is the cold and wet zone, right? This is where, it's really cold and really wet just every day. So when you go outside, when you breathe the air, you're breathing in cold and wet all the time. Now you think, well, you go in your house and your house is nice and dry. Now, but when I thought, well, I'm not healing though in the house. I'm still sick. I've been sick for weeks. Even like staying in and not going out. Still got this constant like phlegm production and fevers like coming and going. So what's going on there? So outside is cold and wet. We know that. Inside is hot and wet. And I realized that actually when we're in the house, we're constantly using water as a means of getting heat inside of us. So whether it is a hot shower, a hot bath, a hot cup of tea, some soup or some hot chocolate, or actually the radiators themselves, which have hot water running through them and produce a low level infrared heat from the hot water. So all the heat that I'm getting when I'm in the house is hot and wet. It's all from water. And I'm consuming huge amounts of hot water because I'm having, I don't even know how many cups of tea a day, a cup of tea every few hours, to keep warm as much as anything. Not necessarily for the love of the taste of tea, but, for the love of a warm drink, to get that fire inside of you. So then I started noticing that all the old houses, the nice houses, have chimneys and fireplaces built into them, sometimes into every room of the house. It was that important to have a fire in your house. Now, a real fire emits all the frequencies of the sun. You're literally inviting the sun into your home when you have a real fire in your home. But these radiators are only emitting a very low infrared frequency, which, may be sufficient to dry your clothes, but it's lacking all the color spectrum, all the UV. It's just totally insufficient to give you a full healing. But these kind of symptoms of snotty nose and everything from excessive cold, wet air, um, that can be quite easily cured by sitting in front of a real fire. And I'm absolutely sure of that. And I'm making sure that I am going to be getting a real fireplace in my house this year, because I think the removal of fireplaces from homes under the guise of preventing air pollution is probably a conspiracy. It probably is a conspiracy. So let's just move on a little bit here then. So if we look at food, for example, and we plot food on a scale of hot to cold and dry to wet, we can categorize our food into different groups based on their humors. So, cold and wet, right? So we might expect that if we're eating lots of cold and wet food, and it's cold and wet outside, it's the cold and wet season, which is winter, and we're eating cold and wet food like dairy and milk and yogurt and butter and hummus and pate, peanut butter, jams, spreads, salads, watery fruits, soft drinks, drinking cold water, ice cream, frozen treats, things like this, then we're actually adding to the cold and wet humor in the body. And we may just constantly produce phlegm. Some people will have a cold for the whole entire winter. But maybe they're feeding it, you see. Maybe they're just eating things. Maybe they're drinking lots of like cold sodas and just adding to the coldness and the wetness of their body, as well as breathing in the cold, wet air whenever they go outside. All right, so, and then hot and wet. Well, these are things like your stews and your soups and ramen, broth, pasta, spicy curries, noodles, chili, tea and coffee, hot chocolate, puddings and mulled wine and all this kind of stuff, right? It's like hot and wet, like this kind of comfort food. But you see, if you're indulging too much in wet stuff, then you're going to have excess wet, So, like I say, the most common symptoms I get when I'm sick is fever and phlegm. So that's hot, wet, and cold wet. Hot, wet on the inside when I'm in the house, cold and wet when I'm outside. All right, so then in the hot and wet, we have, hot and dry, we have like fried foods, toasted, toast, baked things, grilled and roasted foods, or like steak and chips or fish and chips, things like that. Fried rice, spicy cooked dishes, roasted veg, hot breads and pastries. Alcoholic spirits. So, even though it's a liquid, it's a drying liquid. It's hot. Alcohol or whiskey is like fire water, basically. It's actually called water of life water. So and then cold and dry, well, that would be things like your cold meats and cheese and crackers and bread and biscuits. Salty snacks, sushi, sushi can be quite dry. Crisps, baked treats, cakes, confectionery, dried fruit, cereal, popcorn, granola, nuts, seeds. And some other alcoholic beverages as well, like beers and wine and stuff like that, which, again, although they're technically liquid, they have a drying effect on the body. Okay, so, and then, so when we look at the Earth realm and look at the different zones, the different sort of climate zones, like cold and dry, cold and wet, and so on, we use the AE map because, it's the best view of the realm, and it was the standard map of the world before it got globularized, or like wrapped around a ball. But yeah, so when we look at this, you can actually start to see the pattern quite clearly of cold and dry, cold and wet, hot and dry, and hot and wet. So if this just comes into focus here. Okay, so So in the very center then, at the North Pole, we have cold and dry, right? And it's barren, there's no growth. Now, I know we don't know exactly what's at the North Pole, but we know as we go further north, it gets colder and drier. And but then when we come into the next zone here in the dark blue, this is cold and wet. So this is northern Europe and North America. And this is predominantly cold and wet. Then when you get into this zone here, it becomes hot and dry. And, you see that immediately. The green gives way to desert in most of the places. There's some green in this zone, but it's stifled. The growth is stifled, basically, because of the lack of water. And then when we get into this equatorial band, we see complete green all the way, like as green as you can get, right? Because it's hot and wet. And hot and wet actually leads to constant growth. So cold and wet, like we have in Europe, is seasonal growth, which is death and rebirth, right? Because there's a death in the winter and then a rebirth in the spring. In the hot and wet bands, where it's mostly desert, it's stifled growth. It's more competitive, it's more hostile, there's more gnarly creatures because of the excess fire element, and there's a lack of water, so things are more desperate. In the cold and wet, though, there isn't that competition for water because we get so much of it. It's crazy. So the animals are more like docile. But yeah, in the hot and wet regions, which is like the Amazon jungle, the African jungle, and like the Asian, Southeast Asian jungle, yeah, this is constant growth. It never stops. Like the plants don't like have a death and then rebirth like they do here. They just grow constantly, and life just grows constantly. In fact, one of the things I've heard said about these areas is that life is cheap, and this is why. It's because it's actually just so abundant. Like life of all kinds is just like popping out of the earth all the time. So an actual individual life is cheap or not worth as much. But if you go north, an individual life is much more precious, because there isn't the energy available for growth. And it's important to understand as well that when we're talking about hot, cold, dry, and wet, we're talking about the air and the earth, because hot and cold is a measure of the amount of fire, and dry and wet is a measure of the amount of water. So the only two things left are the air and the earth. Right, so we live in the air and on the earth. So we're very connected to the air and the earth. Now, yeah, so we have the hot and wet leads to jungle and rainforest. Hot and dry leads to arid desert. Cold and dry leads to Arctic or ice, and cold and wet leads to boreal or temperate. So it's worth also noting that the moisture level, dry, wet, moisture corresponds with fertility. Yeah, so the word barren means dry, but it also means infertile or incapable of producing life. Okay, so moisture corresponds with fertility. All right, so I think I'll leave it there for now, but hopefully that helps you understand a bit about the humours, and maybe gives you some inspiration about how you can apply this to your life and think about health and sickness in a different way. All right, much love.